for this speaker series. So we're glad to have you all here. My name is Megan King. I am a senior here at the University of Evansville, studying international relations and French, which I started with Dr. Milner. I'm also a member of the Scholars of Syria Executive Board, and on behalf of all of us, I'd like to welcome you all here. Now I have to read my spiel. But if you get a chance to come on down, we got some new merchandise just this morning, actually. So look down here, get some hummus and some tea to keep warm on this sort of cooler night. So it's a great honor that I introduce to you Dr. Wes Milner, who came to UE in 1999 as a professor of political science and international studies. His classroom performance earned him the Dean's Teaching Award in the College of Arts and Sciences, as well as UWE's Exemplary Teacher Award in 2012. Dr. Miller's international experiences include serving as a visiting professor at Arlington College, Tokuho University in Japan, and the University of Virginia's Semester at Sea program. He holds a PhD in political science and international relations from the University of North Texas, proudly, a Master of Arts from George Washington University, Elliott School of International Affairs, and a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and German from the University of Texas. Dr. Milner is also a very strong advocate for Scholars of Syria, as he was a main contributor during our beginning phases, so we thank him for that. And we are especially excited to welcome him back, I should say, as he is one of our returning speakers from last year's speaker series. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Milner.
Thanks for having me back. I guess it didn't go too bad the last time. For those of you who may have been here last year, I wanted to go through more of a background, somewhat historical, moving into the political. It's been well over a year since we've had the speaker series. A lot has changed, and maybe a lot has not changed. And so tonight I want to just focus a little more on just some very contemporary things in the last couple of months, maybe the last 6 months. Focus on some of the challenges, but ultimately lead to a discussion. And I know all of our panelists, we've got much better insight than I can provide. But really looking forward to what comes next. I think we spend so much of our time depressed, and it's easy to get depressed. And so I would like tonight's discussion to be hard-hitting. I try to be as apolitical as possible, even though I'm a political scientist and a human rights scholar, but I also am engaged in a lot of globalization issues. So feel free to stop me anywhere along the way. I get kind of jazzed up, and with my Stark accent, I always tell my great international students, your accent is much easier to understand than mine. So but feel free to jump in. You can inject questions as you would like, but ultimately we'll get to the panel, and I think they can probably answer the questions much more adeptly than I. Well, I was going to put really contemporary things at the very end, but I thought, well, let's kind of get some of the elephant out of the room. Unfortunately, I was out of town the last couple of discussions with Scholars for Syria, so I'm sure the travel ban came up, but it's still in the news, both this first and now the second iteration, starting with 7 countries that were banned from travel to the U.S., went to 6. And as many of you know, there was a lot of rancor, a lot of consternation, and a lot of protest, both here on campus and throughout the country and indeed throughout the world. And we've had a number of ups and downs over these last few weeks. The most recent, obviously, was a second round of federal appellate judges striking down this particular iteration. So we'll see what happens. It seems like a number of politicians are moving on to different things, but we'll just have to remain attentive. I think one thing that has been prevalent is that, and I see some critical-looking faces that are on this screen. I passed Hassan. He was going to another event, said he was sorry he couldn't be here. I think one thing that is indicative of this community, both the UE community and the larger Evansville community, is we've taken the forefront in standing up against those injustices that we feel have to be addressed. And indeed, we are one of the preeminent institutions I know it's hard to believe that the little Evansville, Indiana, and the University of Evansville is really taking a lead. I mean, we had Basel giving a TED Talk, we've had articles in the Washington Post, we had Hassan have a great article in the Chronicle of Higher Education. I actually met with them in Washington a few weeks ago, and they were just laudatory, saying every time we come to the University of Evansville with a question, with commentary, you're there, the students are there, the administration is very open. We've had, obviously, NPR. It's been amazing to see what the students have done and what individual folks, both here on campus and throughout the community. Also, last year, some of you may have known, we were contacted by the Institute for International Education to contribute to a book chapter, and indeed to try to help both folks here and abroad to wrestle with how can we do a better job of breaking things and addressing the challenges for displaced and refugee students. And indeed, I spoke with the Institute of International Education last week, and we are the #1 university in the United States for dealing with refugee and specifically Syrian students. We have the most of any school. We've been in the top 5. But we are now the top. So kudos to me. So if we look back, way back, 6 long years to the Arab Spring, and don't strap in and go, oh my gosh, here we go. It's going to be a long oratory. But just to kind of put it in a little bit of context, with the origins there in Tunisia and Bouazizi, all the way to a euphoria. I think many of us in political science were thinking, wow, maybe this is going to be like the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? We're going to see an implosion of the Soviet Union. We're going to see a 3rd wave, a 4th wave of democratization. This is going to be great. And then we know what happened over the subsequent seasons of despair and disillusion and really devolution into, if not anarchy, a political transformation that none of us would have. And across the board. I mean, you could say that, well, young, small Tunisia, while still struggling, is perhaps leading the pack here in terms of the democratization. But as we know all too painfully, many of these other regional powers have struggled, and struggled mightily, with enormous humanitarian ramifications. This is just a quick, many of you know the complexity of the region, and specifically with Syria. I would like us to always accept that complexity. I think politicians and laypersons sometimes try to oversimplify things, and I think that does us a disservice. Now, at the end, you'll say, well, wait a minute, you're taking those complexities and trying to distill it down into something that's much simpler, and we have to do both. We have to kind of deal with that dissonance. But we need to acknowledge that there is a great deal of diversity. We in the United States traditionally have viewed that as a great asset, right? But in dealing with conflict resolution, it can be bedeviling, to say the least. This is an older chart, but just I kind of like the graphic in terms of the diaspora spreading from the conflict. As we know, the surrounding countries with Syria have taken much of the burden from those that were having to flee. These are very recent figures that we're seeing here in terms of number of refugees. And many of you know, this is the largest refugee crisis we've seen since the Second World War. And unfortunately, there's no end in sight. Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt taking the brunt. And as we know from last year, the political fallout of those countries in Europe that were really stepping up, especially Germany and many in Northern Europe, and Greece as well. Again, these are relatively recent, in the last month or two, fatalities per 100,000 people, and you can see that, unfortunately, Syria has surpassed everyone, even Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, many of these that have been dealing with conflict over the last couple of decades. Absolutely, absolutely tragic and heartbreaking. This is just over, you see here, from the Arab Spring to just last month, February 2017. It gives you a sense of civilians and non-civilians. we know that it's been just a devastating toll on both sides of that particular divide. Here's another breakdown. This is just from last month. Again, civilian and non-civilian, and knowing that each one of those images is a human being. Who's responsible for total casualties, both civilian and non-civilian? And this shows that the Syrian government, Russian government, ISIS, Nusra, opposition forces, and again, there's been a lot of recent reporting that there are atrocities on many sides of this, but most observers would say that the Syrian government has obviously a disproportionate responsibility in these casualties and disaster. Most of you are familiar with Daesh or ISIS, ISIL. It was raised a lot in the presidential campaign. The president's called for the eradication of ISIS from the face of the earth. It's easier said than done, but we, the U.S., became involved heavily in terms of striking air strikes in 2014, and we know that Russia became more engaged in 2015, and then over the last year, increasingly so, especially with Russia and some of the other actors. This is very recent, just in the last month, a graphic that shows some of ISIS control, December, about 3 months ago. And you've probably been reading quite a bit that there have been advances of the coalition forces and of the various opposition to retrench or at least pull back the real estate that's controlled by ISIS. Many would say that's a very good thing, but in that even comes its complexities. Then we'll see. This is U.S.-led coalition airstrikes both in Iraq and Syria, and you may have been seeing a lot more about that in terms of what's going on in Mosul versus what's going on in Raqqa. They are connected but fairly distinct, and I think that's, again, complicated both our understanding of this particular conflict and potentially what might be the solutions to both of these conflicts, even though they're conjoined now. And this is, again, just from 2 days ago, this particular graphic. This is the only slide I pulled in from the Elasticus discussion last year, and you're like, oh my God, this is one you retained. It's a train wreck, right? I mean, look at it. It's not simple by any stretch of the imagination. Here's a little bitty United States right over here in the corner, which some would say is appropriate, because we haven't been as engaged as one might want. If you're looking at Syria and Iraq, the Islamic State here forged in between, Turkey, that we'll discuss quite a bit this evening, very, very pivotal. Iran, obviously, has been for years funneling money, troops, influence through Lebanon, Hezbollah, and then obviously going to the Assad government. Yemen, this one has been somewhat, I would say, not forgotten, but a proxy war fought next door to or in between the powers of Saudi Arabia and Iran, and have complicated things, and by its own account is one of the most recent humanitarian crises that I think we get a bit, I won't say jaded, but fatigued. You're like, how many crises can we handle at once? Well, if you're the UNHCR, you're the International Rescue Committee, you can't say, no, I'm sorry, we've had too many crises this month. We're going to have to put that on hold and come back with you. Or, I mean, we're not even talking here about Sudan and South Sudan, North Korea, I mean, it goes on and on. You can see as a foreign policy operative, you could quickly get beyond overwhelmed. But this can just give us a sense of, I don't want to overcomplicate it, but just say that it's all interrelated. You can look at the headline and say, well, if the U.S. government would just do this, if Russia would just do this, if Jordan would just do this. Yeah, but it's all connected. These tentacles are, and not only just in the last 6 months, but in the last 10 or 20 years that we discussed last time. Poor Stefan de Mistura has been the envoy trying to forge some type of peace the last few years. He gets great credit for tenacity, perhaps not for success. The closest he would get to even a ceasefire, it would quickly be dashed. And he he keeps trying. He keeps trying. President Obama, right? Not to put politics there, but someone say, well, what did the U.S. do over the last 6 years? And when President Obama came in, 2008, 2009, he was successful very much on the banner of we're going to end our occupation, our engagement, our overreach in Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay, so he came in, drawing down troops. Then the idea is, well, oh my goodness, we have this Arab Spring gone awry. We have a humanitarian crisis. What do? We intervene, we send troops in, we use drones. Do we let things rest, right? Do we use diplomacy? And I think if you would talk to John Kerry, he said, good gosh, we have worked every angle we could with the UN, with our Arab allies, with our European allies, with our adversaries. But the President and the Obama administration has caught a lot of grief and a lot of criticism, saying what we have now may not have been better if there had been more intervention or more action, but we know that the situation that we find ourselves now is not optimal. Okay? So, the key here is what do we do? How do we look to the near immediate term, the medium term, and the longer term? And that's tough for a foreign policy strategy, coalition, because ultimately we have to find a peace. We have to find a peace quickly. We were saying this in 2012 and 2013. We just have to find a ceasefire. We have to find a peace. Ultimately, and this is a big debate now with the new administration, is how do you do that, right? We tend to segregate military and diplomatic and civic engagement. This is a real problem here in terms of civil society. It's gone, it's destroyed, it doesn't exist. How can you have any type of lasting reconciliation without a civic society? It's really, really difficult, if not impossible. So I'll be the first to criticize in the short, the medium, and long term, but I think we all need to be realistic about what in a given day, a given month, a given year is truly achievable. We should never say, oh, well, we just have to settle. But I think sometimes we say, well, we're trying to get this outcome, and people die as we're trying to get to that outcome. So, again, long term, and it's very easy for a political scientist, because I remember when I was actually at the Elliott School at George Washington, I was doing a lot of research on German unification. And I wrote this great thesis and said, you know, it will end, we will have unification in about 25 or 30 years. And it was about 3 months later. And no, you know, all the political scientists and all the foreign policy experts, they said, okay, who saw this coming? Who saw the implosion of the Soviet Union? Everybody's looking around going, nobody, right? Nobody saw this. And you could argue that much of what we've seen in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, we as a global community were ill-prepared, right? So I take the lumps, again, with my colleagues in international relations. And the caveat, Samantha Horton, many of y'all know from NPR, we were having a discussion downtown yesterday. She goes, well, you know, you're an expert on the Middle East. I said, good God, no. I haven't studied the Middle East. I've been to the Middle East. I work with human rights, but far be it from me. So as I always rely on my colleagues, my student colleagues, when you hear a misstatement, go, let's put no cigar. But you may say, wait a minute, this isn't Syria, right? This is the former Yugoslavia. Not, and I'm not a historian, my historian colleagues like to point that out to me all the time. But as a political scientist, we need to understand history. And as we're looking towards what a peace might look like in Syria and beyond, I think we can learn some things. Those of you who lived through and followed this particular conflict when the Soviet Union collapsed and Joseph Tito died in 1980, and you saw the centrifugal ethnic and religious and political forces spinning out of control in Yugoslavia, the world again was caught off guard, going, what in the hell are we going to do with Yugoslavia? I mean, it's been a bedevilment, and many would say really, for the 20th century, some would argue that Sarajevo was kind of the bookends of the 20th century, right? The great wars of the 20th century, the most violent century we've had to date. We're not on a very good path this one, right? You had the start of the First World War. Where was it? Right here. And if you flip to the backside at the end of the Cold War, where did all this start spinning out of control? Sarajevo, right? When this was percolating up, and if you get a chance, I used to teach a course called International Relations with Film, and this is one of my favorites if you're looking for political or international film. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Anybody seen this one? It is a great film because it talks about conflict, it talks about ethnicity, it's funny, it totally disses the UN. They call the Blue Helmets and the UN peacekeepers Smurfs because they're useless, right? But it's a hard-hitting and poignant and beautiful film about what's possible and what's not, and ultimately, we're all just the same, right? We're all just trying to forge a better life for ourselves and our families and our community. So, looking at...
Hey, Wes?
Yes?
You know, on the previous slide you had up there about, political structures essentially and how certain structures may at the end sort of bring things together or bring peace and some kind of tolerance, if you will. But how much is truly dependent on just individuals that, for lack of a better term, get it? And I think of Mandela in South Africa.
You're such a shill. This is great. I did not plan him.
You did. You gave me $5.
No, the point's well taken. There's lots of both psychologists and political scientists and social scientists saying, how much is it the trajectory of history? How much is it groups? How much is it religion, ethnicity? But how much is it of great leaders, of folks that stand up and say, I'm willing to do what it takes and sacrifice my life for the better of the group. So I'll promise I'll get to it. Maybe not Mandela, but Desmond Tutu. But looking back here, people thought, there's no way we can solve this, right? Hitler moving into this area in World War II was like, oh my God, this is a cluster. I'm not messing with it. So well, how in the world can we do it? It was gut-wrenching. It was terrible. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but there is relative peace in this region, right? We've had a lot of new countries sprout up, obviously. Kosovo, this is an older map. Kosovo becoming one of the latest members of the European Union, Montenegro. It's not perfect, but if you look back in 92, 93, 94, 96, many of the diplomats would say, I'm done, I'm retiring. This is just too intractable. Can't solve. The point being that we can, and your point's very well taken, by individuals, both on the ground, like you leaders that are going to be out there saving the world in a very couple of short years, and world leaders that can really do this. It is possible. And this is just a breakdown. If you're looking at ethnic minorities, and nationalism is tough, right? And I think if you look at the last year and a half politically around the globe, it's frightening, right? I mean, it's just all fanned up. We're not just black and white and Muslim and Christian and Jewish and Buddhist. It's nationalism. It's those things that you'll die for, you'll kill for, right? But there's ways around that. So, the UN. We always bring in the UN, and like I said with the Smurfs, there's got to be a role for the UN. Sorry for another movie analogy y'all may have seen. The movie with Sean Penn and, shouldn't bring it up, I can't remember her name, Nicole Kidman. It's the only movie that's shot in the UN, called The Interpreter. And people are asking her, why do you do this? I mean, nothing happens in the UN. It's just talk. And she said, as long as we're talking, somebody's not shooting. They may shoot after we're done talking, but while we're talking, at least we're not shooting each other, right? And that's progress. Okay? If you look at this budget, sorry to digress, the budget that the president has put up, right, it's spending much less on diplomacy and the State Department and USAID, Well, the Pentagon came out and said, whoa, whoa, whoa. And even Jim Mattis, the current Secretary of Defense in 2013 said, if you spend less money on diplomats, I have to spend more money on bullets. Right? This is the Department of Defense. This is your current Secretary of Defense. It's not some whacked out academic or some liberal in the State Department. Right? It's all you mother. So, but we need the UN. As much as we hate it, as much as it's just impotent, you gotta have some UN presence. And we have, looking back to 2015, we had a unanimous resolution. And we have lots of those, and some would say, yeah, more talk and no action. But there has been at least the framework saying we've got to get to a ceasefire. We first have to stop the killing before we can think about what long-term political solutions we can forge. So, we've got new leadership at the UN. Anybody know who this is? Come on. See there, the UN is impotent. You can identify Donald Trump, but you can't identify the new Secretary General that just came on board 2.5 months ago. Antonio Guterres, long former Prime Minister of Portugal, and he headed the UNHCR. He knows something about human rights and refugee issues, right? He spent lots of time in Syria, lots of time in Jordan. Extremely capable. If there is a man or woman on the planet that can wrestle with these issues that he's going to wrestle with, I'm feeling pretty stinking good, I'll tell you. I mean, he is one of the consummate, pragmatic diplomats we've had in a generation. So, this is the, just last month, actually, at the refugee camp just across the border in Jordan. So, back to possible solutions. Here, you can see the breakdown of the Kurdish groups, Islamic State, and you can see here that it has dwindled in the last 6 months significantly. The Iraqi government, right? Syrian rebel forces and the Syrian government, here obviously Iraq, here on the Syrian side, Damascus there, Idlib, Aleppo, and then Raqqa, that you've probably been hearing a lot about. The closer we get, well, let me say, there's a number of things that someone argued that Assad has to go, right? People have been saying that for 6 years. But is that possible now? I think people are looking at the realities on the ground over the last 3 or 4 months, and indeed the intervention of Russia, successful intervention of Russia, and the fall of Aleppo, that perhaps is not obtainable, at least in the immediate future. Now, ironically, yes?
Why wasn't something done about Assad way before now?
Well, it's a great question. There's a big debate about intervention and non-intervention, and there's great arguments of both, right? You could say, well, how about Saddam Hussein? How about Muammar Gaddafi? How about, fill in your blank. And there are instances where the institutions or opposition or international forces have intervened, right? In Iraq, George W. Bush intervened and said, this is a despotic leader. He tried to kill my daddy. I'm going to depose him, right? And we did. And what happened?
In Syria, though, you have another scenario, I think, other than revenge for your dad, in that the United States knew Russia was on the move. They knew it 3 years before they ever entered.
Yep.
So
Yep.
why didn't someone, us, them, Canada, somebody, get a coalition together to there's ways of getting Assad out of there other than killing him.
Absolutely.
Yes, and it was much more feasible in
Yeah.
12, 13, 14. Absolutely.
In UN, which government has the official Kurdish forces or the Syrian government? like for example in China it was Beijing or it was Taiwan, but Taiwan's removed. Beijing was kept. In Syria, which government has the official denunciation in UN? The Syrian government?
Currently,
Yes.
yeah, technically it's not a
Syrian
change.
government.
Yeah, yeah. Nice analogy though, because the UN has been not exactly consistent in terms of who they recognize.
So going back to the lady's point, instead of comparing, what happened in Iraq and Libya after those dictators fell, why don't we compare it to what happened in Serbia, in Yugoslavia?
Yep,
President Clinton intervened there
Yep.
and saved millions of lives
Yep.
there. And this guy, so if we would have intervened earlier, we would have saved a lot of lives.
no, I think your point's well taken. I would say off the record, but I'm in front of all of you, I would agree. As a human rights scholar, I'm usually too quick to intervene, and there's the whole literature and practical study of the right to protect. And the argument is it's all about sovereignty, right? The state, the government. You can't violate control of what goes on within your borders. Well, the right to protect would say no. In international law and international norms, if you cannot or will not protect the basic human rights of your people, you cede that sovereignty. And the international community, therefore, then can usurp or encroach upon that sovereignty. And that's absolutely what happened in Syria and Iraq, and I think in Libya before. Yeah.
But ISIS, whatever, seems somewhat different from other movements that we've seen in the past. Can you compare it to, the fact that so many people came from outside of Syria into Syria to occupy it, that it is not a country, although they declared a caliphate. Can you compare that to another situation in history?
I think you could argue that security analysts and diplomats and military personnel that have followed this over the last 20, 30 years, there has been an increasing presence of non-state actors. Diplomacy used to be a heck of a lot easier, as did military engagement. Because you would engage an enemy, but that enemy wore a uniform. That enemy had an allegiance to a state. That enemy was a state. And that enemy was beholden to international norms. They may violate them, but then they are responsible for the responses from the international community. Does that make sense? And so now we've got many, many more of these non-state actors, and ISIS, Daesh is a great example of that. And so it makes it more complicated. It makes it much more complicated. Again, it doesn't mean that we can't, as the president said, wipe it off the face of the earth. I think that's a little too simplistic, but it is possible. Who's this gentleman? Better get to know him. Rex Tillerson. From my University of Texas. Right? Engineer, spent 42 years at ExxonMobil. I mean, this is a Texan, right? I've lost my Texas card. This guy got it. Right? So who's he speaking with? Just this one. Erdogan, right? Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And he's from? Turkey. If there is a gentleman that's in the crosshairs, if there is someone that is pivotal to this conflict, it's him right there, right? Turkey has not had a good year, right? You've had the coup, you've had multiple terrorist attacks. It is getting even more complicated. But these two folks, you can't, well, I'm speaking, I don't think that this thing is solvable unless you find some way, and I'm not sure how to thread that needle yet, with Erdogan and with the complexities of Turkey. So, where do we go? This is not where we are now. This is actually a report that came out from the RAND Corporation, which tends to be a very conservative think tank. But it's some pretty interesting thought processes. There's a guy that was one of the authors, James Dobbins, who's been involved in nation building really for the last 40 to 50 years. Again, I'm not saying this is what we should do. This is just some options. of saying, how do we, and to your point, it was very good, perhaps we should have done this 4, 5, 6 years ago, but how do we get to a point where we do have a cessation of violence? Not a peace, but just a tenable, relatively sustainable ceasefire. So this is just a thought of some of these scholars and practitioners, that you would essentially admit, at least for the near term, that a number of players have reached their limited, maybe not so limited goals. Russia wanted to be a world player. Russia wanted to retain Assad. Russia wanted to stick it to the U.S. Russia wanted to remain relevant, not just in this region, but throughout the world. Check. Right? Iran wants to keep its tentacles in Lebanon with Hezbollah, right? Successful, relatively. So, what about the U.S.? What's the U.S.'s calculus here? What does the U.S. want? I think the U.S. wants peace. I think Barack Obama wanted peace. I think, maybe the current president wants peace, right? But how do you get there? Well, again, this is just kind of a crazy idea that you would essentially allow maybe safe zones. And Rex Tillerson even raised this. He called them, I don't want to misquote Rex Tillerson, but it was, I can't see it here. Essentially safe zones. Temporary safe zones, okay? But you have to enforce those, right? How would you enforce those? And, especially, you see here, side of proposed international administration, and this is one that could be really, really problematic, is the areas that are being vacated by ISIS and ISIL, right? What do you do with it? Do you allow the Kurds to come in? Well, what's Turkey going to say? And you can see here, the opposition in Turkish controlled areas, Turkey has come in here to prevent these two Kurdish groups from forming. Why? Well, because we know the Kurds, which if we would draw this around, right? Syria, Iraq, Iran, the Kurdish people, the nation of Kurdistan, and indeed you have an autonomous region in Iraq. Well, Turkey fears that. They don't want a separate Kurdistan, okay? But according to these folks at Iran, what if we have an international intervention? You essentially have an international. People even propose this sometimes, right, for Jerusalem. Say, well, we can't have an agreement. Let's just get an international. Bring in the blue helmets. Crazy? So what happens to the regime? Does the regime retain control of this and not expand, and then you wait him out? I don't know. What's the end game? And that's what, a lot of practitioners say, both militarily and beyond, what is the end game? What do you hope to accomplish? If you looked at Yugoslavia, right? And some would say that it took Tito and decades of holding peoples together, but I think many of you would say, well, wait a minute, that's crap. I mean, if you look at the eons of peaceful coexistence in Syria, it doesn't mean that just because we're ethnically or religiously or racially different that we can't cohabitate. But once you go down this rat hole, as it is, of conflict, it makes that extremely difficult. Okay? So again, this is just kind of a thought experiment. Don't go out and say, oh, Milner's thinking about going down this path. There's lots of propositions out there, but especially in the last 3 months with the renewed intervention of Russia and with the problems with Aleppo, I think we're seeing a different calculus by many of the players around the world.
And wouldn't you say something like this happened to the Berlin after World War II when Russia, US, France, and Britain decided to square it up?
Yeah, and if you look at a map of that, and I wrote a thesis on it, spent a lot of time in Berlin, it was crazy. What were you thinking? You take a map and you draw a circle around it and say, okay, we'll split it up 3 ways.
I mean, it was stable.
It was stable. You could say, hey, wait, it did work. And fast forward 45 years, you got a unified Germany. Berlin's the capital. Who would have thought that? In 1946, 47, 48, say, just wait a few years. Berlin's going to be the capital of a peaceful, prosperous, and the most generous refugee resettlement power on the planet. You would have thought they were crazy. So what I always tell students is never underestimate the unknown. So again, back to Syria, I mean, we have to envision, I won't say utopia, but we can't settle for something less than what we desire. But it just may take a while.
This is
Right?
this is very important point where you should not let settle for less. You know.
No.
And as a person who lived in Syria, because I'm also Syrian, the problem that Malcolm described earlier that it does not take into consideration what the Syrian wants.
Right?
You know, to solve the problem for the whole world, for Russia, for the U.S.
Well, I guess the question would be, which Syria? Well, we have
There's
total
This is
consensus?
one Syria. It's simple as that. One Syria. People have been living there for thousands of years.
Absolutely.
Muslims,
Peaceful.
Christians, Jews, from
Yep.
all, you know, from all over the world. You
Yep.
know. But the problem with that proposal is dividing the country to, you know, zones and this. I'm a Syrian. I would never agree with something like that.
Right. And it gets back to
Do I have
the,
a solution? No, I really don't.
and it gets back to
I don't
the,
have it. I wish I do have
the
it.
question of, do you intervene? You say, wait, if we, the U.S., the UN, European Union, organization of
And when there is you know, enough honest will to solve the problem, it can be solved.
it can
The main problem there, right, like that you have in the charts, President Assad killed 80% of the people, his own people.
Yep.
And until that person is gone, the problem can be solved. It's really as simple as that. So unless there is a will of the strong nation as the United States to interfere and want to solve that problem for real and for good and once for all, that we can. We are a superpower.
Yeah, but with
When we want to be, you know, when we want to be.
these folks here, in the foreseeable future, that's not going to happen. I just don't see it. I'm not saying it shouldn't, but I don't see it.
I think they missed their opportunity.
Yeah. So, you recognize all these? Yes? Remember, this is a test. You know him, right? Everybody knows him. He's Saturday Night Live, he doesn't wear shirts. But, you know, folks in the Kremlin are saying, wow.
You dealt with the Syrian students here, and you saw firsthand what is different than any other student probably dealt with in Iraq. You know, they are capable, very capable to take care of the country.
Absolutely.
Basically, all they need is just chance.
Yep,
Basically,
absolutely.
that's it.
So the question is, how do we get to that
I
chance?
wish I had a solution right now.
Yeah, no pressure, right? No pressure. So, to circle back to your good point, oh, I did, I apologize, I sure did. Yeah, that's Papa Assad that died in 2000, and people thought, oh my gosh, maybe Bashar al-Assad will be different. No, that's exactly right, I apologize. Yeah, his son, he's not going to be the same much, at least when we're at. So, where do you go? Well, I would say you go to folks like this, and you go to folks like this. Desmond Tutu, who I spent some time with when I was with Semester at Sea, and I tried not to plug him, but I was like, oh my God, for a human rights junkie, you're like the icon. Give me some knowledge, you know, and so I just pepper him and stuff. He's like, can I just check the cricket score? Can I just, you know, sip on my drink? But the truth and peace reconciliations that he and his colleagues forged in South Africa after all-race elections in 1994, where people stood in line 7 and 8 hours to vote. And it shouldn't have happened, right? If you looked at that, said it should have been a bloodbath. It should have been a war. Now, many of y'all been to South Africa recently. It's troubled. It's broken. The rainbow country is struggling. But it didn't devolve into war, right? But it took folks, back to your point, John, it took individuals like these on the front row and all of us sitting here to make tough decisions, to make sacrificial decisions. And we can do it. I mean, I tell my students, you know, even as depressed as I get from a human rights and globalization scholar, I just have to look out to the students and I think, no, there is hope. I mean, there's more Desmond Tutu sitting right here that we'll read about in 10 and 20 years and say, oh my gosh, look at what they're doing. And they're forging peace where no one thought it was possible. Right? I always say, look at the Brits and the U.S. We hated those sorry suckers, right? We wanted to, I mean, then we tried, my brother, the Japanese and the Americans, really? We interned our own people. Now, unbelievable allies. So never say never. It may take us a decade or two, and we don't have a decade or two. So the clock's ticking, we gotta get going. But I think with tenacity and with understanding, and I would say vulnerability, right? You have to reach out and go, gosh, I'm fearful, I may be ignorant, and I'm vulnerable. I mean, how can I, that's what, right? You're afraid you're gonna lose whatever, fill in the blank. Your security, your religion, your freedom, whatever. And that's tough, right? That's really tough. But these good folks are going to lead the way. And I have no doubt whatsoever. No doubt. So I'll leave it there. We'll get to the panel and get some real answers. Okay?